I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the sharp crack of rubber exploding beneath my truck tires, a sound so violent and sudden it felt like a gunshot in the stillness of the morning. And when I leapt out of the cab and saw the twisted strips of metal teeth glinting in the sunlight across my own driveway, I realized with a chill that someone had deliberately tried to trap me in my own home. But what made my blood boil even more was that I already knew exactly who had done it. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the woman who lived 3 houses down with a manicured lawn, a permanent scowl etched on her face, and a thirst for control that made her believe she owned not just her property, but everyone else's too. And as I stood there staring at the damage to my tires, my hands curling into fists, I knew this wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was criminal. This was dangerous, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Because she had crossed the line from annoying neighbor into something far darker. The kind of arrogance that ends in consequences she could never imagine. And what she didn't know, what she could never have guessed, was that by setting her little trap for me, she had just set herself up for a reckoning that would end with her wrists locked in steel handcuffs, flashing police lights washing over her smug face, and the entire neighborhood watching her empire of intimidation collapse in a single night. But before I could get there, before justice could be served, the road to that moment would twist and darken, filled with secrets, betrayal, and a battle of wills that would push both of us to the brink. And as I bent down to pull the jagged spike strip from beneath my truck, feeling the sharp edge slice my palm, I swore to myself that I'd see this through to the bitter end, even if it meant uncovering things about the HOA, about Karen, and about this community that no one was supposed to know. And that vow, the one I made with blood dripping from my hand onto the cracked concrete of my driveway, was the spark that would ignite everything that followed. The escalation, the confrontations, the sleepless nights, and the final showdown that would leave one of us ruined. Because this wasn't just a feud anymore, it was war. And the first battle had already begun when my tires blew out on my own property. Yet as furious as I wasn't reckless. I knew better than to storm down to Karen's porch and scream at her like everyone else did when she crossed them. No, I decided to play it smart, to gather proof, to build a case. And I set up hidden cameras along my driveway that very afternoon, every lens angled perfectly to catch her red-handed. Because I knew her arrogance wouldn't allow her to stop after just one stunt. She'd come back, she'd push harder, she always did. And the more power she thought she had, the sloppier she became, and as the first night fell, I sat in my living room with the blinds half drawn, staring at the flickering security feed on my laptop, every muscle tense, my ears straining for the crunch of footsteps outside. And when just past midnight, the shadow of a figure crept into frame, dragging something metallic and long behind them. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my chest. And as the night vision snapped her face into clarity, there was no mistaking it. It was Karen herself, crouched low, her eyes darting nervously as she bent down to position a second spike strip across the gravel. And in that moment, my anger crystallized into something cold and focused. Because now I had her. Now I had undeniable evidence of her sabotage. But instead of rushing out the door and confronting her, I forced myself to wait, to watch, to let her finish what she thought was a clever plan. Because the more rope she gave herself, the tighter it would strangle her when the time came to pull. And I remember sitting there, my fists clenched on the table, whispering under my breath, "Keep digging, Karen. Keep digging," while she laid her trap and vanished back into the shadows. And by dawn, when I replayed the footage and saved it to 3 separate hard drives, one thing was clear. This was no longer a neighborly dispute. This was evidence of intent to cause harm. And I knew the police would take it seriously if I presented it the right way, but even as I thought that, a part of me hesitated. Because I had lived here long enough to see how Karen twisted things, how she charmed officers, how she manipulated the HOA board into believing she was some saint keeping the community in order. And I realized that if I went to the cops too soon, she'd spin it. She'd turn it into some ridiculous excuse, claim she was putting them there for security, and maybe, just maybe, they'd believe her. So I made a choice, a dangerous one. To not only collect evidence, but to push her, to bait her into going further, to make sure when I finally dropped the hammer, There would be no escape, no loophole, no sweet-talking her way out. And so I let the spike strips lie there that second day. Didn't move them, didn't mention them, acted like I hadn't even noticed, and sure enough, when I left for work and parked my rental car on the street instead of the driveway, I saw her curtain twitch and her lips curl into a thin smile, like a predator who thought the trap was working. But what Karen didn't realize was that she had just walked straight into mine. Because while she thought she was winning, the net was already closing around her, and the deeper I dug, the more I uncovered things about her life, her finances, and the HOA itself that made me realize she wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was hiding something huge, something worth destroying people over. And as the sun set that night and I sat watching her silhouette in her lit-up living room, glass of wine in her hand, her smug laugh echoing faintly through the quiet street, I knew the confrontation was coming, the collision course was set, and when it hit, it would be explosive. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that by setting out to catch her in her own lies, I was about to step into a web far darker than I ever imagined. One that stretched beyond Karen, beyond the HOA, into a truth that would make the spike strips look like child's play. And as my phone buzzed with a new anonymous text that simply read, "Stop digging or you'll regret it," my pulse spiked, my breath caught, and I realized with a chill that I wasn't just up against Karen anymore. Someone else was watching. Someone else was invested in keeping these secrets buried. And by ignoring that warning, by choosing to fight back, I had just painted a target on my own back, and it was only a matter of time before the first shot was fired. The text glowed on my phone screen like a warning flare in the dark. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." And though the words sent a cold shiver crawling up my spine, something inside me hardened instead of caving. Because fear wasn't new to me, intimidation wasn't new, and if whoever had sent it thought they could scare me into silence, they had just made the mistake of pouring gasoline on a fire already burning out of control. So instead of deleting the message, I screenshot it, stored it with the footage of Karen sneaking onto my property, and swore that if she thought she could keep her secrets by hiding in shadows, I would drag them into the light, even if it meant tearing down the entire HOA to do it. And that night I parked my car 2 blocks away, crept back on foot, and lay low in my yard with the cameras ready, my breath fogging in the cool air, my ears tuned to every rustle of the trees, until just after 1 in the morning when I heard it. The crunch of cautious footsteps on gravel. Too soft for an animal, too deliberate for coincidence. And when the figure emerged from the dark, I expected Karen. But my stomach dropped when I realized it wasn't her at all. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes and gloves, carrying what looked like a toolbox. And as he crouched near the driveway and began tinkering with the cameras I had set up, I froze, rage boiling in my chest. Because this wasn't random, this was sabotage. And it meant Karen wasn't acting alone. She had help. Maybe even someone orchestrating things behind her, and I knew if I confronted him now, fists would fly, but I forced myself to stay hidden, snapping photo after photo, and when he finally retreated into the night, I tailed him from a distance, keeping to the shadows, my heart hammering as he cut across yards and disappeared not into Karen's house, but into the HOA office itself, a squat building at the end of the cul-de-sac that was supposed to be locked after hours. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just Karen's vendetta. This was the HOA itself, the entire board, pulling strings behind the scenes, and I had just stepped into something far bigger than neighborhood pettiness, something organized, something dangerous. And as I stood there in the dark, staring at the glowing light inside the supposedly empty office, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the HOA wasn't just about property rules and dues. Maybe it was cover for something else entirely, something worth destroying me to protect. And when I returned home and reviewed the footage, finding half my cameras had been disabled before they could even record, the threat on my phone made chilling sense. They weren't just warning me. They were telling me exactly what they'd do if I didn't stop. And that thought should have scared me into silence. But instead, it made me reckless, made me obsessed. Because if they were this desperate to keep me quiet, then what I was about to uncover had to be worth everything. And so I dug deeper, pulling property records, financial statements, even minutes from HOA meetings. And what I found sent chills down my spine. The board had been funneling HOA dues into maintenance projects that didn't exist, the money vanishing into shell accounts tied to companies that never did any work. And at the center of those approvals, her signature on nearly every line was Karen's name. But here's the twist that made my stomach knot. Mixed in with those transfers were payments going out, not to contractors but to private security firms, the same kind that specialized in surveillance, sabotage, and intimidation, the same kind of firm that could send a man in the dead of night to disable my cameras. And I realized with horror that the HOA wasn't just crooked, it was operating like a criminal syndicate, one that would silence anyone who got in their way. And Karen wasn't just a bossy neighbor, she was a gatekeeper to something much darker. But as much as I wanted to go public with it immediately, I knew better. Because if they could sabotage cameras and send threats, they could easily destroy me, frame me, even make me disappear. And so I decided to play their game instead, act like I was backing off, like I was too scared to continue, while secretly building my case. But Karen must have sensed something, because that very week she showed up on my porch with her plastic smile, HOA violation notice in hand, her eyes glittering with that smug confidence she wore like armor, and she said in her sugary, venomous voice, "We've had complaints about your truck being parked overnight on the street. It's against community guidelines." And I almost laughed in her face because she knew damn well my truck's tires were shredded thanks to her. But I played along, nodded, even apologized, because I wanted her guard down. But the whole time my phone was recording her, capturing every word, every slip in her tone when she hinted that non-compliance leads to consequences, and I knew exactly what she meant. But then came the real twist. The one that left me reeling because later that night while reviewing my recordings, I spotted something in the reflection of her sunglasses when she leaned forward. A faint shape. A figure standing just behind her, tall, male, wearing the same kind of jacket as the man who sabotaged my cameras, which meant she hadn't come alone. She had backup watching her, making sure I didn't try anything. And that realization made my skin crawl, because it meant they weren't just trying to scare me, they were monitoring me, tracking me, maybe even inside my house already. And as if to prove me right, the very next evening when I returned home from work, I found my front door slightly ajar, the lock intact but the frame splintered. And inside, though nothing appeared stolen, I noticed small things shifted, the position of a picture frame, the angle of my chair, the faint smell of cologne that wasn't mine, and my stomach dropped when I checked my hidden laptop drive and found it gone. The one that held backups of all my evidence, and though I still had copies off-site, the message was clear. They could get in any time they wanted, and they wanted me to know it. And that night, as I sat in the dark with a baseball bat across my knees, every creak of the house making my pulse race, my phone buzzed again with a new message. This one even shorter, more chilling. "Next time we won't just look around." And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about spike strips or harassment anymore. This was life or death. And if I didn't find a way to outplay them soon, I might not live to see Karen in handcuffs. But just as despair started creeping in, fate twisted in my favor because the very next morning, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside, only a single flash drive and a note scrawled in messy handwriting, "You're not the only one she's hurt. Meet me." Midnight. Pier 7. And my hands shook as I turned the drive over. Because whoever had sent it wasn't threatening me. They were reaching out, offering information, maybe even an alliance. And though every instinct screamed trap, I couldn't ignore it. Because if Karen had other enemies, maybe together we could finally bring her down. But as the clock ticked toward midnight and I parked near the abandoned pier, the fog rolling thick off the water, my nerves electric, I couldn't shake the thought that this meeting might be the turning point. Either the chance to crack the entire conspiracy wide open, or the perfect setup for me to vanish into the night, never to be heard from again. And when a figure stepped out of the mist, their face hidden under a hood, and whispered my name like they'd been waiting for me all along, I knew with a sick certainty that whichever way this went, my war with Karen and the HOA had just reached a point of no return. I should have turned back the moment I heard my name whispered out of the fog at Pier 7. But curiosity mixed with desperation pulled me forward, every step on the damp wooden planks echoing in the silence. And as the hooded figure lowered their head just enough for the dim street lamp to reveal a face, my jaw nearly dropped. It wasn't some stranger. It was Martin, the quiet, soft-spoken treasurer of the HOA board. The one everyone thought was harmless, always carrying spreadsheets and invoices, never speaking up unless someone asked about dues. And yet here he was, alone in the dead of night, passing me a flash drive with trembling hands, whispering that Karen wasn't the one I should be worried about, that she was just a pawn in a much larger game. And though I wanted to scoff, to accuse him of luring me into a trap, his eyes darted nervously to the shadows as if he expected to be shot where he stood. And when I finally asked what was on the drive, he muttered only one word that made my blood run cold: payoffs. And with that, he shoved it into my pocket and fled, vanishing into the mist before I could stop him, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. But when I got home and opened the files, my hands shaking, what I found shattered the little I thought I understood. Because inside were scanned bank transfers, email exchanges, and private meeting notes that proved beyond any doubt that the HOA board had been laundering money through false fines, shell vendors, and bogus projects. But the shocking part wasn't just the theft. It was the recipient. Because buried in those records was the name of a law firm tied directly to the county commissioner. The same commissioner who had signed off on every questionable zoning change and enforcement order Karen had ever demanded. And suddenly it all made sense. Why the police brushed off complaints. Why Karen acted untouchable. Why the board moved like a shadow government. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood committee. It was a cash funnel feeding into political campaigns. And Karen's role was to keep the neighborhood tightly controlled, silencing anyone who questioned where their money went. And in exchange, she got protection, power, and free rein to terrorize us. But if Martin was the whistleblower, I realized with a sinking dread that his life was in danger now, and maybe mine too, because whoever stood behind Karen wouldn't let secrets like this spill without blood. And sure enough, just 2 nights later, news rippled through the community that Martin had been found dead in his garage. An accident with carbon monoxide. But I knew instantly it wasn't an accident. It was cleanup, a message to anyone thinking of talking. And as I stood among the small crowd at the edge of his driveway, watching the flashing lights and the body bag being wheeled out, I caught Karen's eyes across the street and she smiled. Not her usual smug smirk, but something colder, like a predator baring its teeth. And I realized she knew I had been at the pier. She knew I had the drive. And now it was only a matter of time before they came for me too. But instead of braking, I leaned harder into the storm, making multiple encrypted copies of the files, slipping them into safe hands, even mailing one anonymously to a journalist out of state. Because if I went down, I wanted the truth to outlive me. But as I dug deeper into the records, connecting dots I hadn't seen before, I stumbled onto the most gut-wrenching betrayal yet, my own neighbor and friend. Daniel, the guy who had barbecues with me, borrowed tools, complained about Karen over beers, was listed as a paid consultant on multiple transfers, which meant all those nights he nodded along, agreeing she was a nightmare. He was part of it, feeding her information, maybe even the reason she always seemed one step ahead of me. And when I confronted him casually over the fence the next day, dropping hints about things only an insider would know, his eyes flickered with panic before he forced a laugh. And I knew in that instant that he was dirty. But what made my stomach clench was realizing that meant every conversation. Every plan I'd shared with him had likely been relayed back to Karen, and suddenly the threats, the break-in, the sabotage made sense. They had eyes and ears right next door. And as fury mixed with betrayal in my veins, I made a decision that would change everything. I would stop playing defense, stop waiting for them to strike, and take the fight directly to Karen herself. But not with fists or shouting, no, with her own weapon, exposure. And so I orchestrated a neighborhood meeting, innocently framed as a discussion on new parking enforcement rules. But in reality, it was bait, a stage where I planned to confront Karen in front of everyone with the evidence. But as the night arrived and the community gathered in the clubhouse, the tension electric, I realized too late just how dangerous this play was. Because as I took my seat and saw Daniel smirking from across the room, Karen strutting in like a queen with her binder of violations, I noticed two men I didn't recognize sitting in the back. Thick-necked, unsmiling, watching me instead of her. And I understood then that this wasn't just a meeting. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. But before I could slip out, Karen slammed her binder down, announced to the room that I was under review for harassment, threats, and failure to comply with HOA rules, and produced photos of me taken through my windows, edited to look like I was plotting something violent. And the gasps around the room told me she had prepared to flip the entire neighborhood against me, to make me the villain, and as I rose to defend myself, pulling the flash drive from my pocket, she smirked. And I suddenly realized the projector was already wired, already waiting. And when Daniel plugged in his own laptop, the screen filled not with her corruption, but with fabricated files painting me as the thief, me as the saboteur with transfers mocked up in my name, and the betrayal hit me like a gut punch. Martin's flash drive had been a decoy, or worse, altered after he gave it to me, and now I was the one cornered, the one branded guilty, and as the crowd murmured, the two men in the back rose to their feet and moved toward me. I knew I had only seconds to escape, but before I could bolt for the door, Karen leaned close enough for only me to hear, her breath hot with triumph as she whispered, "You thought I was the queen. I'm just the pawn. You'll never touch the king." And as I shoved past the men and sprinted into the night, her words echoed in my skull because suddenly it all clicked. Karen wasn't the mastermind. She was the front, the distraction, and whoever the real king was. They had just turned the entire neighborhood against me, branded me the criminal, and I realized with gut-churning dread that unless I found the true puppet master pulling the strings, I'd be the one in handcuffs before dawn. I hit the cold night air like a fugitive on the run, my heart hammering in my chest. Karen's whispered words replaying in my skull. "I'm just the pawn. You'll never touch the king." And for the first time since this war began, I felt the walls closing in because no matter how much evidence I thought I had, no matter how many backup drives I'd stashed away, the truth was clear. I had been outplayed. And the real power behind the HOA was still hiding in the shadows, untouchable, watching me flail while they painted me as the villain. And as I sprinted down the quiet streets, the glow of porch lights flickering on as neighbors peeked out to see the commotion, I knew the hunt had shifted, that finding out who the king was had become my only shot at survival. Because if I didn't unmask them soon, I'd be the one in a jail cell or a body bag. And so I vanished for 3 days, sleeping in motels, burning through prepaid phones, combing through every file I had left, chasing every lead. But the deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. Because everywhere I turned, I found doors slamming shut. Witnesses too scared to talk, bank records scrubbed clean overnight. And the one journalist I had trusted with an envelope of documents suddenly stopped returning calls. His voicemail chillingly replaced with a robotic message that the number was no longer in service. And it hit me that the king's reach extended far beyond the HOA board, into law enforcement, media, maybe even the courts, which meant the game was already rigged against me, but desperation makes you reckless. And that recklessness drove me to dig into the one angle no one thought I'd touch. Karen's personal life. Her finances, her connections outside the HOA, and that's when I found it. Buried in a property record that didn't match her lifestyle, a deed co-signed by a man named Harold Whitaker, a name that set off alarm bells because Harold wasn't just anyone. He was a retired judge with decades of influence in the county. A man whose rulings had mysteriously favored developers tied to HOA-controlled neighborhoods. And suddenly the puzzle pieces snapped into place. The missing king Karen had taunted me about wasn't just some shadowy figure. It was Judge Whitaker himself pulling strings from behind the curtain, laundering HOA money through legal channels, silencing opposition with rulings, and using Karen as his enforcer on the ground. But as satisfying as that revelation should have been, it terrified me. Because going up against a retired judge with political allies and deep pockets was suicide. And sure enough, the very next morning the hammer came down. Police cars screeching up to my motel, officers pounding on the door with a warrant, shouting my name, accusing me of fraud, harassment, even assault. All fabricated charges backed by evidence I knew had been planted. and I barely slipped out the back window with my bag before they kicked the door in, sprinting across the lot as sirens wailed, realizing that I was now officially a hunted man, my face likely plastered across bulletins as the unstable neighbor. And it was in that moment, crouched behind a dumpster with adrenaline flooding my veins, that the weight of it all nearly broke me, because I had no allies left, no safe place to go, not even a reputation to cling to, and the temptation to just give up, to let them take me and end the nightmare, gnawed at me like a vulture circling a dying animal. But something inside refused to yield. That same spark from the first day I saw the spike strips on my driveway, the promise I made to myself that I wouldn't let her, or them, win. And so I pushed forward, calling in the one favor I had left, an old friend from my army days who owed me his life. And when he picked me up on the outskirts of town, his old pickup rumbling like salvation, I spilled everything, every detail of the HOA, the king, the judge, the frame jobs, and though his eyes widened in disbelief, he didn't hesitate, just muttered, "Then we take the fight to them." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tested immediately when we returned to my house under cover of night, hoping to recover the last hidden backup of my files, only to find the front door wide open, the place trashed, papers shredded across the floor, and a message spray-painted across the living room wall in blood-red letters. Checkmate. And in that instant, the illusion of control shattered. Because they weren't just trying to silence me, they were toying with me, stalking me, proving they could take everything I owned and turn it to ash, and the near downfall hit me full force. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was prey, cornered and bleeding, my every move anticipated. And as I sank to the floor in the wreckage of my home, fists pounding the tiles in rage, I realized I had only two options: disappear forever and live as a ghost, or strike back with everything I had left and risk being crushed completely. And it was in that moment, my mind a storm of despair and fury, that my phone buzzed again, a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a voice I hadn't heard in years whispered, "I know who the king really is. And it's worse than you think. Meet me tomorrow, alone, or we're both dead." And the line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring into the shattered glass of my window as the night wind howled, knowing that this meeting was either my last chance to bring the truth crashing down, or the trap that would finally end me for good. The night of reckoning came not with a whisper, but with the thunder of truth demanding to be heard. Because by now, the HOA wasn't just a petty collection of nosy neighbors and suburban tyrants. It had been unmasked as a sprawling web of greed, corruption, and intimidation, and I had one last chance to bring it all crashing down before they buried me for good, figuratively or literally, and the face of it all. The very mask that had smiled sweetly at city meetings while seeding malice in every corner was none other than Karen, the woman who had thought spike strips on my driveway would be her crowning act of dominance. But tonight she was about to learn that every tyrant eventually meets a downfall carved by their own arrogance, and I was going to be the one holding the chisel. Because the file I clutched in my trembling hands contained every invoice, bribe receipt, falsified HOA fine, and whistleblower testimony that the task force had painstakingly gathered under my cooperation. And though the darkness outside my window pressed like a warning, though I knew men loyal to the HOA king were still circling in their black SUVs, I refused to let fear dictate the end of this story, because too many had suffered silently for too long. Too many families had lost homes, reputations, and even lives to this suburban empire of cruelty. And now, with law enforcement and the DA waiting in the wings for my signal, all I needed to do was get Karen on record, force her to admit the truth, and the dominoes would fall until the so-called king had no more pawns left to protect him. But of course, Karen didn't make it easy, because when I lured her to my property under the pretense of one last negotiation, one last chance to settle this feud before it went nuclear, she didn't come alone. 3 board members flanked her, their eyes scanning the shadows, one hand always twitching near the bulge of something under their jackets. And Karen herself wore that smug smile that had haunted my nights, the smile of someone who believed herself untouchable, who had been told by powerful men that she was the untouchable queen of this chessboard. and her first words cut like venom-laced daggers. "You really think you can fight us? You're one man against an army, and armies don't fall to stubborn fools clinging to principle." I said nothing, only gestured to the chairs I had set up in my garage. The cameras hidden but active, the microphones catching every syllable, and though my heart hammered like a war drum, I knew this was the only way. Their own words would destroy them. Karen sat, crossed her legs, and leaned in like a predator, savoring the illusion of control, while the others loomed behind her, and I asked the questions not like a man beaten, but like an executioner sharpening his blade. "Who gave you the authority to put spike strips on my driveway? Who signed off on the fake fines? Who told you to keep pushing until families lost their homes?" At first, she danced around the answers, smirking, mocking, twisting my words. But then arrogance slipped through the cracks, as it always does, and she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You think this was about you? We did this because we could, because people like you are too stupid to fight back. And yes, we did it on orders, but not mine. I'm just the hand that swings the whip. The real master doesn't get his hands dirty." My pulse surged because she was close, so close to saying the name that would lock the final piece in place. And I pushed harder, my voice low and unyielding, telling her that her empire was already crumbling, that her king had abandoned her, that the moment she confessed, she'd be nothing but another discarded pawn, and anger twisted her face into something grotesque, because she couldn't stand the thought of being expendable. And in that slip of fury, she spat the name, the king himself, the shadow developer whose money had fueled everything. And the instant it left her lips, I gave the signal. My phone vibrated once. The task force was moving in, SUVs screeching into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing red and blue, shouts tearing the night apart, and chaos exploded as the board members panicked, reaching for weapons only to be met by drawn guns and shouted commands from federal agents. And Karen's composure finally shattered as cold steel handcuffs snapped around her wrists, her protests drowned by the Miranda rights echoing through the humid night air. But even then, even as she was dragged toward the flashing lights, she tried to claw back some semblance of control, screaming that the king would never fall, that I hadn't won anything, that I'd only bought myself a target on my back, and maybe she was right. Maybe danger still loomed in the shadows where power likes to hide. But as I stood there watching the woman who had tormented me, who had turned my life into a battlefield, finally reduced to a prisoner of her own hubris, I felt the weight lift. Not just for me, but for every neighbor who had lived under her iron rule, every family who had cowered at her letters and fines, every child who had heard their parents whisper in fear of foreclosure. And though the war against the king wasn't finished, the queen had been toppled, the board broken, and the first stone cast into the foundation of their empire, and in that moment of flashing lights, sirens, and justice, I knew the story had finally turned, not in favor of power, but in favor of those who dared to resist it.